Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Laurie Manchester. I am an associate professor of history in the School of Historical, Religious, and Philosophical Studies here at ASU. I'm connected to this topic and that my current book progress is on the largest ethnic return migration of ethnic Russians to the Soviet Union, and they came from China mainly after Stalin's death. And their leaving China and going to the Soviet Union had a lot to do with World War II. So I am delighted today to introduce Dr. Oleg Beyda. I will introduce him, and then he will give a presentation on his book, which is prominently displayed right here, available on Amazon.com, the first of its kind on a subject which has been woefully neglected. After Dr. Beyda finishes his presentation, I will introduce Dr. Jan Mann, who runs and teaches in our World War II MA studies program online. So Dr. Beyda received his BA and MA in Moscow in political science. Shortly thereafter, he emigrated to Australia, where he received his PhD in history from the University of South Wales in 2019. He is currently a recently tenured professor of history at the University of Melbourne. In 2013, he published his first book in Russian on the French Legion in the service of Hitler, 1941 to 1944, a topic I knew nothing about till I looked at his CV. His third book will be published in 2026. He is the co-author of it. It is titled Soviet Turncoats, General Andrei Vlasov and the Russian Liberation Army, 1942 to 45. And that book is about true collaborators in that General Vlasov and most of his men were Soviet citizens, unlike the white Russians we're going to be discussing today. So the book he is presenting on today, published in 2024 by University of Toronto Press, is entitled For Russia with Hitler, White Russian Emigres and the German-Soviet War. It is based on research in nearly 40 archives in 10 countries. And most importantly, because of the political nature of this topic, it is based almost exclusively on contemporaneous sources, not on sources that were how people wanted to present their service after the war. It has been named as a finalist in the European History category in the 2025 Association of American Publishers, AAP, Prose Awards, which for a first book is quite an achievement. So I will now lay down my microphone and turn it over to Dr. Beyda.
All right, thank you all very much. Thank you for having me. Thank you for introducing me. I'll quickly share my screen with you. Just give me a minute. I'll speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we will take, hopefully, all of the questions that you have. Almost 100 years after the Second World War, this is where we find ourselves, and we see that in many countries, the memory of this war has become one of the pillars of national identity. And in Russia, it is a veritable substitute for lacking national ideology. Some would say that the sheer magnitude of this war serves as an explanation for that fact. And this was the defining moment of the Russian 20th century. But maybe there's more to it. Not as well studied and perhaps lingering in obscurity, perhaps the defining moment came 20 years prior with the Russian Civil War of 1917 to 1920, where the Red Revolutionaries clashed with white anti-Bolsheviks. After all, it was that conflict, the Russian Civil War, that brought about the 7 decades of Soviet rule. And then there's a topic where the two wars chime in discordant and tragic harmony. Perhaps the wars indeed never end as long as their participants are alive. The result of the Russian Civil War was not only the 7 decades of Soviet rule for its victors, but also a birth of the world in exile for those who were defeated. This Russia abroad waited patiently for a chance to renew its struggle, unfinished struggle, in fact, and replay its civil war. And the Second World War became a mere backdrop in that sense for them. The active minority of exiles who still believed in the cause of what they called Russia's liberation, they did participate in the Second World War on the Axis side. How come? The military exile, in many ways, provided the backbone of the Russian exile. It was the military man on whom many waited to remain active, and it was they who were to deliver the final blow in a showdown with the Bolsheviks whenever it happened. And as the hundreds of thousands of evacuated Russians dispersed all over Europe and the world in the early 1920s, the commander of the Russian army, General Pyotr Nikolaevich Wrangel, found a unique organization that was there to save the military. And thus, this is how ROVS, or Russian All-Military Union, came to be on September 1st, 1924. Not only was ROVS intended to maintain the cohesion of the former white movement, but it was aimed explicitly at mobilizing émigrés for a possible renewed war against Bolshevik state. In fact, ROVS was a disguised, demobilized army. Its structure and coherence built on the camaraderie of the Civil War, and the conviction of those veterans was that the war for honor of the motherland, one of the key components that they highlighted, that honor is not lost and that war is not over yet. Participation in the ROVS was on a voluntary basis. ROVS itself as an organization acted through the system of отделы, or departments. These were administrative units, each with its own head. Each had a group of staff members, and then they were divided into sub-departments. A department covered either a single country or a number of countries where émigrés resided. Following further dispersal of the Russian military men and civilians all over the world, ROVS had departments popping up in countries such as Australia, Brazil, Argentina. Altogether, this was a very prominent organization with roughly 40,000 members by mid-1930s. The whites were extremely active, and I do share the idea that, in fact, the Russians, these exiled Russians, presented a real nation in exile. They had just about all the trappings of a modern nation, minus the defined national borders. They had churches, they had religion, they published newspapers, they had political parties, they had political quarrels, they had professional unions and clubs, they had their own art, their own painters and philosophers. As you can see from this talk, they even had their own army, armed forces, and all of it was separate from the hosting nation. In their officer societies, clubs, and little restaurants, they gathered forces, they waited, they revered the olden glory and preserved banners, celebrated military anniversaries, wrote history, debated past battles, but also prepared for war. So they attended lectures, they analyzed when the imminent collapse of the Soviets would occur. Everything in their life, and I mean everything, was suffused with the arch goal of returning home, finally going back. And so exile to them was not an end station, but a limbo. It was a temporary space where one's loyalty to Russia was put to the test. Resisting foreign culture's influence, they maintained their children's Russianness in terms of language, religion, and belief. The emigres considered the Bolshevik rule no more than a bloody aberration of national history, and thus their favorite New Year's toast was "for the next year in Russia." But as time passed, the Soviets, who were not supposed to present any constructive force, they did not collapse. The whites developed a particularly painful combination of feelings towards the motherland. There was a sense of personal tragedy, of abandonment, of the collapse of the world, mixed in with suffering, and that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, as their thoughts and feelings lingered and remained at home, there was also a very strong, pronounced component of Russian nationalism, and all of that was only further galvanized by Orthodox Christianity. However, at the same time, they saw that something else is underway at home, and the people were probably changing under the tectonic shifts of collectivization, Stalin's rule, Red Terror, the campaigns. So the question was, had they ceased to be Russian? Are they Russians? Or were they Soviets now? Or was it all just a mere mask, a yoke that the Bolsheviks had placed on the peoples of Russia? They lied to them. Did they buy into that lie? But the time it kept its confusing march, doubts started creeping in, and we're talking early to mid 1930s. Doubts led to debates. If the collapse of the Soviets was not happening, then an intervention was on the cards, the one that would certainly precipitate this collapse. And this scenario the Whites called the Spring Offensive. There would come a day when a country, a Western country, maybe an Eastern country, would invade the USSR because the Bolsheviks were the same gangsters, and European powers, for their own sake, should see it. So foreigners were bound to invade. And then what? And then there was a split amongst the most active of those military emigres. The 1930s brought two camps, two positions. One group later called defensists, regarded any collaboration with the foreigners as an absolute anathema, unacceptable, especially if it involved supporting them militarily in the event of a war. The Russians were to liberate themselves on their own, and then the Whites could help. And the other group, known as the defeatists, maintained that any measures were justified in pursuit of the main goal, the destruction of the Soviet state and the overthrow of the Red authorities, any means necessary. The Russians, maintained defeatists, could not liberate themselves on their own, so the Whites should help first via this foreign route, and then come what may. But foreigners want Russian land, they want resources, they will be killing the future of Russia, said the defensists. We need to be with our own people, wherever they are, whenever they are. And the defeatists retorted, certainly. And we are with our own people. The Bolsheviks are worse than anything, worse than any foreigners, because the foreigners, even if they occupy Russia, they can never stomach it due to its size. They can never understand it because they don't understand the holy Russian soul. The Reds are the worst of the worst of the worst, since they are killing not just the body, but the soul of Russia. But foreigners will only kill the body, and only for a short period of time. Foreigners are bound to fail eventually. Rov's ideologues called defensists' obsession with land and borders territorial fetishism. So they said the land, the body, does not matter. It's the soul that matters. And of course, granted, I spent almost 2 decades studying these people now, and the book is based on tens of archives, as Laurie already said, all these libraries and private collections. So for some people, bad news follow. In the thousands of periodicals and documents of the many military immigration organizations, and ROVS is the main one, and smaller ones, smaller crews, I have almost never seen any defensist argument espoused. It may be said, and I would maintain that the absolute majority of the officers held defeatist views. And this was especially true of the more right-wing circles, including all the monarchists. The idea of defending the Soviet Union under any circumstances struck these people as an absolute absurdity. Worse so, they saw the defense of the Soviet Union as a betrayal, a deliberate betrayal of the national cause. What was that cause? Just as during the Russian Civil War, Rovs could not come up with a coherent ideology and strictly stood for the principle of non-predetermination. Some might portray this as their weakness. So non-predetermination meant that we're not going to tell Russia what it's going to be politically before we get there. Effectively, it's in line with what the White Army itself stood for, that there will be some sort of national council which will decide the future of Russia, and the task of the army, the aim of the army, is to fight the enemy, is to fight the Reds. And later on, we'll see. So some people portrayed this non-predetermination in exile that continued. They portrayed it as weakness. But in my mind, in fact, it was a paradoxical strength. While many right-wingers toyed with various forms of fascism, Rovs, on the other hand, provided this comfortable plasticity where it mattered most. The attempts at chiseling an ideology, yes, they were there. Rovs tried to characterized itself, so to speak, through other means politically. They tried to create what they called the White Credo in the mid 1930s, but that fell apart. So in the end, Rovs operated on two principles: militant anti-Bolshevism, and there were also kind of various elements of imperial nostalgia and Orthodox Christianity in the mix. So militant anti-Bolshevism, Orthodox Christianity, a holy war, a just war was supposed to set the record straight. And after the victory, one will see what happens. And then there was Nazism. If one is trying to define National Socialism in short terms, it would be anti-Semitism, anti-communism, biological racism, and the idea of living space in the East. Naturally, defeatists were originally inclined towards right-wing politics. From the aforementioned list, their grand narrative included the first 2 points, namely anti-communism and anti-Semitism. Only a handful of Russian emigres embraced racism lock, stock, and barrel. So, for the most part, military emigres were against the idea of Lebensraum and this living space in the East. Some of the immigrants, even generals, actually read Hitler's book. They read Mein Kampf. They discussed it. And what was the reaction? For most of them, they did not believe that Hitler meant what he said. They did not believe it. As Lieutenant General Alexander Lukomsky put it, these were just, quote, terrible words, and the reality will be acceptable to Russia and not terrible. The reality was becoming more and more confusing. The new war was about to come, and with it the 1939 Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, when two totalitarian giants, the USSR and Nazi Germany, reached an understanding and divided Europe on their own. This strange handshake of the pact between the states that hated each other threw many military emigres off balance. But the Russians continued to believe that any rational, they constantly highlighted this, and they said rational German government would choose to negotiate with them and at least employ their consul, because, well, the Germans don't understand Russia, but we do. And in the meantime, if an opportunity to fight presented itself, Rovs seized it, sending volunteers to Franco's Spain and, in a more limited fashion, to Mannerheim's Finland during the Winter War. A lot of the inner workings of the Russian exile were known to the Nazis, who by the late 1940 controlled most of Europe, and thus they controlled the emigres in it. The Germans ran a very tight ship with regards to Russian emigration. There were informants. They read bulletins. They perlustrated private correspondence. They circulated orders. They intercepted a lot of the correspondence as well. They even, in fact, the Germans had a small sub-department within the secret police dealing exclusively with Russian emigre issues. That's all they did. Great specialists, first historians. And all the while, these hopes for a rational future or even friendship maybe between this future nebulous Russia and Nazi Germany, all these hopes, they proliferated among the whites. The National Socialist Germans at the same time deplored and abhorred the idea of employing the Russian emigres because they saw what these people stood for. The crux of National Socialism laid in the occupation of the living space in the East. Eastern Slavs were considered subhumans, natural slaves, who were to work until they die for their German masters for the next 1,000 years. There could be no talk of any sort of Russian national independence for the occupied Russians, let alone a respectful relationship. As early as March 1941, Germany's leadership took an ideological stand that excluded the use of emigre Russians in the war against the USSR. The Nazis thought that the intelligentsia from the emigration, quote, will not be accepted by the Russian people, and besides, it is hostile to the German nation. And then there was one more motive. Quote, moreover, under no circumstances must we, meaning National Socialists, allow substitution of the Bolshevist state with nationalistic Russia, which in the end, history's evidence, will be again confronting Germany, unquote. Russian emigres did not enjoy any favors in the eyes of the Führer, Adolf Hitler himself. This was the only group of foreigners he, Hitler, personally banned from service in his army in under 1 year, in 1941, multiple times. In 42 and 43, more bans on the service of the Russian emigres followed suit. Nationalist Russia, said Hitler in the summer of 1941, shortly after invading the Soviet Union, nationalist Russia was more dangerous to us than the Bolshevik one. We are not interested in these people's aspirations. Rov's chiefs themselves, not knowing about such instructions, on the eve of Germany's attack on the USSR, attempted to make contact with the high command of the Wehrmacht, the German army, in order to gain official approval for taking part in the coming war. So it was obvious. It was obvious, April, May 1941, that dark clouds on the horizon, things are going to happen soon. These attempts, official attempts, were in vain. On the 1st of August 1941, so it took the Germans a few months to process their request, Rov's pleas for employment were once again officially rebutted. 22nd of June and Hitler's invasion of the USSR had arrived in the meantime, despite what many of those emigres would say later. Despite what a lot of historians write today, and it's hard for them to write because, well, the record is very clear. Maybe that's why this topic is so unpopular. For a lot of exiled Russians, the 22nd of June 1941 was a day when the sun rose twice. All of a sudden, the 20-year wait that had become so tedious, so hopeless, so painful, all of that was over. At least it seemed so. The prophecy of Russia's imminent liberation was at hand. I will quote just one letter from a regular Rov's member who was packing his bag already. Quote, "An event of utterly impossible scale has just happened. Great Germany, new national Germany, new Europe is fighting against the international power in Russia. For 20 years, all of us were waiting for this happy day, the day of war, the day of international's defeat, and the day of liberation of our unfortunate motherland. Within the first few minutes, a question arose for me. What will we, members of the Gallipoli Union and the Union itself, do? Remain passive spectators and not help the German nation at all? People who from the 22nd of June 1941 onwards have become our direct allies and the allies of all those people of Russia? We simply cannot, we must not, and dare not." Unquote. And head of the Rovs in Germany, this lovely bald-headed gentleman, General Alexei von Lempe, had to take an unpaid leave from his work in Berlin, unpaid leave to read all the volume of the incoming correspondence. He complained in summer 1941 that he cannot physically read all of it. He cannot physically calm the Rovs members down. And I concur. In the hundreds of letters I read, this same mood of absolute ecstatic jubilation is present. But maybe it was just an aberration since the sources came from the Russian side. And no. I read German diplomatic corps, secret dispatches, secret messaging in 1941. Serbia, so this is all German diplomats in all of these countries. Serbia, Spain, Slovakia, Germany itself, Denmark, France, and a few other countries. And all of them complained that Russian emigres were coming to embassies after the 22nd of June 1941. They are coming to our embassies in droves. They volunteer for service. They offer their help. They offer their advice. They're constantly badgering us with questions. When will you create the Russian formations? When are you creating them? Why are you not creating them? So the diplomats were firing off these telegrams to Berlin. What should we do? What's the lay down a ruler, please? And Berlin replied, what do you mean? What should you do? Send them back. Provide them with nebulous, very polite, be polite, nebulous, polite answers. And Jesus Christ, what Russian formations? What are they talking about? The Führer has spoken. None of these people are to be employed. In spite of the fact that the Germans did not want to see the Russian emigres in the ranks of their own army, there is much evidence that large numbers of individual emigre attempts were made by these Russian exiles. They tried to join the Wehrmacht either which way, and some were in fact successful. Then there was another problem already on the German side. So now we're kind of switching our angle. The Wehrmacht was not ready for the war in the USSR, period. Out of roughly 900 military interpreters from Russian who were to facilitate contact with the population. So they invaded the country of that size having only 900 people who could speak Russian, like properly trained interpreters. That tells you something about the preparation. So out of that 900, only 50 were ready, 50 for the whole army. This created what I call a window of opportunity. So the army HQs, the German army HQs, mere weeks before the invasion, were given a green light. They said, well, you don't have any Russian speakers. All right, suit yourself. You can go and you can tap these local European Russian diaspora for willing cadres to substitute for the shortfall. Okay, you need to employ some people for a few months. Go ahead, it's fine. This was a direct breach of all the orders from above, the party bans, the Hitler bans, even, all of it. But the army simply overlooked these edicts in light of military necessity. The RAF simultaneously was, of course, very disappointed by this neglect, by the disrespect, and then by the arrests of Russians and their internment, which had taken place in France. But RAF's members did not vacillate. Russia's fate was at stake for them. And so, despite the Germans' seeming indecisiveness in using the organization as a whole, volunteering was still the right thing to do. That's how RAF's members saw it. Russian exile was in a flux. Summer, autumn 1941. In Berlin cinemas, boastful Die Deutsche Wochenschau German weekly newsreel enjoyed compulsory viewing, so they would show you these clips before you would watch an actual movie that you came for. Contemporaries said that one could always tell who in the audience was Russian in those Berlin cinemas. These people bawled their eyes out. By late summer of 1941, ROVS gave its members official permission to act independently, to join the war as interpreters for the German army, as engineers for its auxiliary organizations, medics, postal workers, drivers, cooks, etc. The only request was to keep in touch, keep a regular contact, tell us where you are. The road home was open, or so it seemed. The first individual emigres entered the USSR with the invading Wehrmacht, in fact, already on the 22nd of June 1941. Some followed only a few weeks later. Young Nikolai Umrichin, who was born already in exile and had never seen Russia, traveled from Prague to Berlin right after the start of Barbarossa, and then went to the front line, and he wrote home. That's from his private letter, quote, "Yesterday, that is 12th of July, 1941, was for me a day I shall never forget for my entire life. At 8 o'clock in the morning, I entered Russia. I do not know how to describe the feeling, joyful and at the same time painful, that took possession of me. I was happy at the thought that I was in the motherland, but depressed by the sights I beheld." Unquote. The return aroused complex feelings the only thing I can think of is it was akin to a religious catharsis. The way the emigres reacted to crossing the border can be compared to a very profound, deep religious experience, intertwined with hopes, patriotism, hatred, and the affronts associated with the 20 years of exile. So it's all kind of boiled down into this one little day of crossing the borders. For a group of exiles from Bulgaria, the border crossing took place at the village of Dubashari, where the old border of the Russian Empire had once been located. As soon as their vehicle drove onto the bridge, the emigre officers in German uniform stood up without command, took off their German steel helmets, and began crossing themselves. The German officers their jaws dropped, complete astonishment on their faces. Feelings of melancholy immediately followed the sense of homecoming. The emigres found abandoned villages, profaned churches. What had once been their homeland had turned into, quote, empire of darkness. This is one of their characteristics. Traversing the old Russian border at the river Dniester, some emigres crossed themselves, some got out of the vehicle, kneeled down, kissed the Russian earth. Quote, "It was very moving." This is one of those who did it. "It was very moving. Tears welled up in everyone's eyes, and each of us understood and felt our responsibility since we had returned to the homeland during the difficult times of a terrible war." And again, this is summer 41. Similar episodes occurred hundreds of kilometers from Dniester in the close rear of Army Group North. So we go almost 1,000 kilometers, in fact, to the north. Crossing the border in the north in late September 1941, Dmitry Karov, he lived in Paris before that, Dmitry Karf was agitated but did not display any emotions. A Wehrmacht captain, so they're traveling in this passenger car. A Wehrmacht captain in the front seat told him that, previous emigre interpreters, I've seen some scenes over the last few weeks. One said, stop the car, got out, kneeled, started kissing the earth. Another one said, stop the car, this is a Russian forest. I'm going to spend the whole night in this forest listening to the Russian nightingales. I haven't heard them in 20 years. A third one ran out of the car, got out some little bags and started putting soil into those bags. The German officer asking him, what are you doing? He's like, this is Russian soil. I'm going to send it to France, to all my friends. This is holy Russian soil. Such striking initial reactions at the border immediately marked the emigres as distinct from all of them, all other German and Axis troops who invaded the USSR. Other invaders simply had no reason to behave that way. The identifying signs of the country, the vast expanses, the turquoise, low sky, the shapes of the peasant huts, all of that summoned up nostalgia in the interpreters. The sense of having returned home was strengthened by the sound of everybody speaking Russian. One interpreter described the sound of such speech as music. Another one was happy to hear people swear and curse in Russian. He wrote, I haven't heard this for 20 years. To me, it's better than any opera. A few emigres saw Russia as a living organism that suffered through its people. Another quote, I literally wept with joy when for the first time in all of my 25 years, I saw Russia with my own eyes. Poor, dirty, weeping Russia. As early as the summer of 1941, some emigres began to conclude that the adverse changes that had taken place were irredeemable and irremediable. Quote, the first impression is that the old Russia has died. Now there are two Russias. One consists of the people of the older generation who remember better times and who greet us as saviors. That is, the peasants greet the German soldiers, German invaders as saviors. They bring flowers and fling themselves on us to kiss our hands. Then there's the new generation that would make you despair. Most of them are hooligans in the full sense of this word. They lack any kind of principles. They're a hungry, spiteful band, and it's difficult to make people out of them. Everywhere the Jews are in control, so you can't help becoming a Judeophobe. They've literally drunk the blood of the people. In my activity, I have to sort out a lot of delicate questions. Both the Germans and the population come running to me with everything. Our soldiers, so he's referring to Germans as our soldiers don't steal anything. They pay for it all. But the real trouble is there is so little of anything that people generally don't want to sell. Poverty, tears, desolation. That's what Russia is like. Again, this is all private correspondence. All of these guys are writing to their relatives in Paris, Berlin, and wherever you are, saying all of that. Others came to understand in the autumn of 1941 that the country they had known and waited for was no more. Despite this, living without hope was impossible. And many emigres wanted to believe, just like over the last 20 years, and they continued, in fact, to believe in some kind of this Russian national future. It must happen. It's there. The hope for this future took diffuse forms, very diverse forms, and was linked to the ability of Russia to restore itself. Often, sources report a very positive yet illogical planning for the future, a planning that had not yet taken a precise shape. It is hard to say whether this was a genuine feeling on the part of the peasantry that the emigres detected, or whether the interpreters simply inserted their own sentiments into the picture. Such thinking, like the Russian national future, the sun will rise again, such thinking disregarded practical politics, such as the fact that the Germans never wanted any national Russia to eventuate. Russia simply had to resurrect itself. It had to resurrect itself. Or else all of these hopes nurtured through decades of exile, all of that would have been in vain. Their lives would have been in vain. Such rivulets of information shocked those who had remained behind and evoked a wish to do something to help. So those people who didn't go to the front line, they're still in emigration. What can we do to help? In Rov's bulletins published alongside letters from the interpreters depicting the wretched life in the USSR, there were appeals, in fact, to send humanitarian aid and religious literature to the East. Help your kin kind of thing. The emotional shock, the scale of the changes that had occurred, and the huge differences between life in Europe and in the USSR influenced even the way the emigres perceived time and reality. In December 1941, an engineer from Prague who was serving with Army Group Center wrote that although he had spent only 2 weeks in the East, that is, in the occupied Soviet territory, it seemed as though an eternity had already passed. Another one said in 1942 that he felt as if he was experiencing a nightmare and he couldn't wake up. Quote, "It sometimes seems as if I'll wake up and find that all this has simply been a dream. It's simply impossible to describe how the Soviets have crippled people." Unquote. One of the most surprising pages of this invasive homecoming was that many emigres encountered relatives and former White Army comrades in arms who had remained in the Soviet Union after the Civil War. So they haven't seen these people for 20 years. An invader cannot expect to find the second home in a country they are invading. And out of all the millions of Axis soldiers who crossed the Soviet border in June 41, no other group had this absurd characteristic to their disposition. So these emigres, they invaded with the Germans, with the French, with the Spaniards, with whoever, and they found sisters, cousins, aunts, those who had been left behind 20 years ago, those who thought their relatives were dead, lost in the whirlwind of the Civil War. The most piercing case I remember, like it just shocks you. You can't believe some of these things when you read them. A young emigre went from Berlin. He volunteered as an interpreter, went to the front line, and he reconnects with his mother in autumn 1941 after 20 years in exile, seeing her walk in the streets, small town near Moscow that the Germans had just taken, goes down the street and he sees her, he jumps off and he says, he approaches her, comes to her. Of course, she recognizes him, he recognizes her, and he addresses her, "How do you like the weather today?" And then they both break down and start crying and shake uncontrollably. And another Russian interpreter sees it and he says, "Can you believe that? Can you believe that?" In their assessments of the Russian people and meaning their attitudes towards the prisoners of war as well, the emigres were divided into, at least I divide them into two unequal categories, or rather, perhaps they were located across a spectrum, a twofold spectrum between the two positions. Nationalistic optimists, and that's the majority, and cynical pessimists, and that's the minority. Most of the exiles regarded the Russian people with sympathy, with compassion, setting no barriers between themselves and the civilian population, and thus I would consider them to have been optimists. Contacts with the peasants took place through ideological filters developed in emigration and provided a litmus test for this Russian national future and for whether it can happen or not. Then, naturally, there were the German crimes against the civilian population and the progressive dashing of emigre hopes for a better national future. And here as well, we also see uneven categories. Just about all of the emigres who served in the East saw one or another form of criminality. Worse so, a minority of those emigres participated in it, unfortunately, including in the Holocaust. I have a separate chapter in my book on emigre criminality, so I really don't want to, horrify you with dreadful things that some of them did. We just say that it happened, and you can read on it more if you wish. The crimes were compartmentalized as well. The destruction of Jews, so they sharply separated Jews, ethnic Jews, from the good peasants, quote unquote. The destruction of Jews did not command much sympathy among the emigres. At best, a cold shoulder due this traditional anti-Semitism of the military men of that era, but mostly emigre materials are drenched in anti-Semitism of varying saturation and radicalism, but anti-Semitism nevertheless. Many of them blamed the Jews for the Russian Revolution, and this led them to easily buy into the whole myth about the Jewish Bolshevism. However, crimes against the simple Russian peasants, city dwellers, and Soviet POWs revolted the emigres. horrified them almost universally, and many tried to help those people. They espoused a particular tunnel vision that certainly they thought, this is just bad actors in a particular village. This is just a separate case. This cannot be a case of consistent German policy. Well, because why would they do it? Why on earth would Germans try to make the population into the enemies of their own and thus the friends of the Bolsheviks? And I collected a whole array of sources from the Soviet side where people spoke about meeting this returning white. So again, we see the picture from the other way around. In many cases, these interpreters were the only people ready to help the locals, ready to save them, unlike the conscripted Germans, unlike Spaniards, Italians, whoever. On the contrary, cynical pessimists, so this minority from the exile, they deplored the Russian population for their perceived depravity, for cattle-like nature, slave-like nature, slave-like attitudes. These are all terms from how they characterize their own people, or they didn't consider them their own people anymore. In fact, many emigres wrote about the slaves and the enslavement of the Soviet system that the Soviet system had brought about. They characterized it in such terms such as martyrs, slaves, gray mass, etc. And remember, it was all about the soul of the people that needed to be saved. So there was a fork in the road of perception. One could either, if you're an immigrant, if you're in that position, you could either focus on the dirt, the lice, the poor condition, and say that people, oh, they lost their soul. And thus you would despise the Soviet slave. And that almost invariably landed an emigre in the camp of pessimism, which rendered accepting Nazism and its murderous practices that much easier. In fact, turning separate members of Russian diaspora into unapologetic supporters of National Socialism, even, in fact, in some cases, into its anti-Slavic stance. So they come back and they're like, oh yeah, look at those slaves, oh, disgusting, terrible, the Führer is a genius. But, that's just a handful of cases. Or, and that is the absolute majority of cases that I studied, the emigre would elect to look beyond the dirt, the lice, the ragged clothes, the poor life. Yes, they would say, these people were slaves, but we embrace them, we cry with them, because their souls are alive. Their souls is where this true Russia dwells, and it's from the soul that our future Russia will restore itself. So we need to help them. We can't fill it. They are poor people. We need to help them. After 1945, key figures of the military emigration rarely reflected on their wartime experiences, which led to an even shorter, scarcer source base. And when the emigres did reflect, most of the time it was with pride rather than regret. Rare cases pointing the other way when it was with regret rather than with pride. They do exist. I found them. I published some of them, even as you can see on the screen. But these were rare. Their anti-Bolshevik ideology, forged during the Russian Civil War, remained unchanged. And in a twist of dark irony, they were with their people during their time of need, just as they had promised they would all throughout the 1920s and 1930s. The whites distinguished their participation from Germany's objectives, that is racial colonization, and they sincerely condemned German crimes while avoiding deeper scrutiny of their own role, the role of an auxiliary. It was, for them, a fight for Russia, and it started in 1920, and not for Germany, which invaded in 1941, and that's what they maintained. Though their motives were non-German, their vision of a non-Soviet Russia aligned with Germany, that vision looked utterly, deeply absurd if Nazi plans for colonization and domination were to be remembered. And by joining the Wehrmacht, they inevitably served German interests, not future Russia, and thus not Russian liberation. But they continued to believe that it was so. White emigres in the Wehrmacht were perhaps the embodiment of contradictions that continue to feed much of the tragedy of the Russian 20th century, both within the USSR and beyond it. The hopes did not align with the reality. The reality proved to be horrible and violent. Roles proved to be illusory, and only ideals, this prideful, mournful martyrdom for the cause, was to soothe the pain of disastrous decisions. The biggest point of contradiction was perhaps in a triangular mental deadlock of roles and choice. Those who swore to fight against the Bolsheviks at any cost could have never made a different choice, and yet they also vowed to save the Russians, and they then ended up serving a regime that devastated and planned to enslave the nation that they took an oath to liberate. Over the years, I asked myself thousands of times if there is one brand or stamp or paragraph perhaps with which I can characterize the story and the deep, deep tragedy of these people without blasting them as a whole, without simplifying, without lying about the record, without taking sides. And I must admit that so far I have so far failed at finding the right words and right characterization. Perhaps these words do not exist, and all of the combinations do not properly deliver the grasp of contradictions and passions these people lived and fought under. Having lost everything in 1920, the Whites carried their identity like a banner. Under that banner, they became one of the most fascinating pages of Russian non-Soviet century. And under the same banner, they suffered the second final defeat in 1945. Thank you all very much.
Okay, before I introduce, thank you so much, Dr. Beyda, for that wonderful talk. Before I introduce our discussant, I just want to point out that I forgot to mention that Dr. Beyda is also the co-editor of at least 5 translations that I know of, 2 of which were translated into English, or not just translations, some of them were publications of the original Russian. One of them you just showed, which is of the White Russian who fought with the Spanish. But the other one is of a Leningrad blockade survivor. So Leningrad, a third of the population died during World War II because the Germans had encircled it. It was almost impossible to get food in. So now I will turn to our discussant, Dr. Jan Maan, who received his PhD from ASU in 2016. He is currently Associate Clinical Professor in the School of Historical, Philosophical, and Religious Studies here at Arizona State. He founded, teaches in, and runs our online interdisciplinary master's program in World War II studies. He is a former Fulbright scholar, and he is the co-editor of a collection of scholarly essays along with Olga Kucherenko of the Eastern, and it's called The Eastern Front, War, Myth, and Memory, published by Routledge in 2024. He is currently completing his first book, which is titled Written in Our Blood, Creating the First Official History of the Great Patriotic War. And like Dr. Beyda, he is the author of numerous scholarly articles and articles published in edited volumes. So I now turn the floor over to Dr. Maan, and I just want to say that after he is done, we will first turn it over to people in the room who might have questions, and I am now moving myself down there. Where is there also a microphone? Okay, so this is, I'm going to be doing some running back and forth. Okay, so I'm going to go see some of the online questions.
Hey, thank you very much. So first, thank you, Oleg, for writing this book. When we think about collaboration in the Second World War, a minor contingent of emigre translators, engineers, and truck drivers is rarely what draws our attention. In many ways, this monograph is a significant accomplishment on a topic that I think few scholars could do justice to. The subject in and of itself is a double-edged sword in that you're looking at a minority of a minority, not just Russian emigres, but specifically around 5,000 who volunteered to serve on the Eastern Front, and more so, those who were able to leave behind traces of their experiences. Here, in part, I would argue is also a limitation of this work, in that the wide variety of sources that were consulted resulted in a somewhat dispersive approach. Even if the vast majority of these volunteers in general held similar beliefs with respect to the Soviet state, the various competing organizations in France, Germany, Prague, Spain, Belgium, and other European locations meant keeping track of so many personalities, and future goals and aspirations could at times become a hindrance to the larger discussions you engage with. Simultaneously, however, one of your arguments is that their lack of a unifying goal actually shaped the needed flexibility and space for them to create reasons for why they should participate in the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union. For someone who does not have a background in the emigre movement and their ideological convictions, it was a bit of a struggle to keep straight all the various personalities and organizations, but at the same time, I cannot imagine writing about these volunteers without going into at least some of this important detail. Something that immediately struck me was the idea that these emigres are ideologically stuck in the Civil War period and are looking for champions who could continue the fight for them. Although there is no comparison with Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, there were numerous parties intervening in the Russian Civil War period. And here, for these emigres, was another chance to depose the Bolshevik regime, a regime now viewed even more so through the lens of Judeo-Bolshevism. Similarly, within the Soviet Union during the interwar period, the fight to uncover white guards or monarchists continued as well. So in some ways, both sides kept the environment of the Civil War fresh in their minds. And this idea of a civil war can also be found in a recent chapter entitled, quote, "Ordinary Men with Guns, Police, Partisans, and Civil War in the German-Occupied Soviet Countryside," end quote, where Ken Slepian described the partisan war and anti-partisan operations in the occupied territories of the Soviet Union as a civil war experience. And your work very much complements that argument and adds an additional layer. So 2 questions for you. One is a specific question. At one point, you claimed that the emigres did not doubt the Nazis would defeat Soviet Russia. Was this based on ideological beliefs or what happened in the First World War? Or was it an inevitable extension of previous Nazi victories on the continent, or a combination of all of the above or none of the above? And then a broader question, because of my concentration on the Second World War rather than the emigre population. Right, so keeping the focus on the war, do you think your work challenges an established understanding of the Second World War or the Eastern Front? Or does it more so add an additional dimension or layer to a familiar narrative? And that can include treatment of POWs, knowledge of the unfolding Holocaust, complicity of the Wehrmacht in the Holocaust, etc. Thank you.
Leah, would you like to answer those questions?
Sure. Sure. First of all, thank you all. Thank you, Jan, for such poignant question and such an extended commentary. I'll start with the first one, and that is, why did they think that the Germans would win the war? I would say it's a combination of both. They also, to an extent, the emigres, that is, they bought into the German propaganda at the time because they were kind of, well, they didn't have any alternative sources, right? They would crack open those newspapers and watch those cinemas, and they just believed it because, in a way, also they were predisposed to believe. They wanted to believe. They never seriously considered one of the things that you can see changing mid-war or thereabouts. So when the first interpreters and engineers, whoever, come back and they tell them, actually, boys, you know, they would deliver lectures in Prague or Berlin, and they would say, boys, this is a different Red Army. This is not this ragtag gang of Bolsheviks and drunken Navy men that we fought against during the Russian Civil War. No. These guys are very serious. They're disciplined. They got tanks. They got artillery. This is not a game anymore. But they thought, well, it's because the Bolsheviks, of course, they're good. So if the Red Army was good, then it was good because the Bolsheviks enslaved the Russian soul and put it in their service. So it's like the Russian soul is actually good, not the Bolshevik army. But if the Bolshevik army, let's say, wasn't performing in a victorious fashion, then they effectively blamed the Bolshevik army. So it's like, damned if you do and damned if you don't. Yeah, so the short answer is they thought that Germany is going to win because the Soviet Union, if the Soviet Union is there, it's also back to their own ideology. If the Soviet Union is there and it's a strong state, then what kind of hope do you have for this Russian national future? It was supposed to be dirty and terrible, and it was supposed to be weak, and it was supposed to fall apart. And of course, it's going to fall apart when the European force of such magnitude and such professionalism, because they actually like the German army, because they go back and they're like, wow, this is like the lifeguard regiments of the olden times. Fantastic, you know. Just about all of them praised as one of them wrote, a good machine is working, after seeing how the Germans just encircle and annihilate whole armies, you know, in 41, 42. A good machine is working. So that's the first question. The second question, refresh my memory. The challenge, whether I challenge. Well, I would hope so. I would hope that we are finally stepping aside from this whole idea that it was Germans and only Germans who were fighting on the Eastern Front. In fact, it was just about everybody. right? And in variety, in this diversity, there is a place for Russians, and there is a place for Russians who were non-Soviet. In general, this whole book, this whole project, I believe I and other colleagues, and Lori, of course, we all contribute to this alternative Russian history, just alternative 20th century. Because when in the West people say Russia, Russians, they usually mean Soviets with regards to the 20th century. But then we find out that there is this whole alternative universe outside of the confines of former Russia that lived and fought on, as we can see, for decades after the matrix, that is the Russian Empire that spawned it, had ceased to exist. And that's fascinating in and of itself.
Okay, we have a question from Stephen Batalden, but before I take that and run over and do my magic, or maybe David will come and whisper it in my ear, we'll have something going on, maybe some kind of trolley card. I want to see if there are any questions from the audience, the live audience, the on-ground audience. Eugene, yes. Okay, so
You want me to read out the question from?
but you don't have a microphone. All right, so you read it and then I read it into the microphone?
I think I can speak loudly enough. Can everyone hear me?
We can all hear you, absolutely.
Ironically, the current Russian regime would have us believe that the Ukrainians are driven by fascist motivations, while your account of ROVS is about Russian collaborators with Nazis. Were there Ukrainian elements among the RVOS leaders?
Okay, thank you for the question. We need to define what you mean by Ukrainian elements. Are we talking about ethnic Ukrainians, or are we talking about people who believed in the Ukrainian national project? Ukrainian immigration, by the way, also participated in this war and also on the side of the Germans. But these organizations hated each other. Rovs saw micronationalisms or non-Russian nationalisms as one of the future problems to deal with, and especially if I were to simplify, white emigres did not believe that Ukraine is a country. They believed it's a territory, right? White emigres did not understand and always say they served in the German army. They would try to stand against the proliferation or the kind of taciturn support of, let's say, Ukrainian nationalism during during World War II by the Germans. They would tell the Germans, like, what are you doing? No, you shouldn't play with those nationalisms. So Ukrainian elements, were there ethnic Ukrainians among the Rovs members? Absolutely, 100%. But they saw themselves as serving Russia, and they had a Russian identity first and foremost. Were there Ukrainian emigres who went to the East just like Rovs members did, as interpreters, engineers, doctors, what have you? Yes, as well. And I also read their memoirs just in order to familiarize myself. But it's the same, in many ways, the same motivation. Anti-Bolshevism, anti-Semitism, all that, but of course with separatist tendencies. So Ukrainian emigres wanted an independent, nationalistic Ukraine, and Russians wanted nationalistic Great Russia.
Yes, Eugene, and if you're not loud enough, I will paraphrase.
Okay. I was interested also in the national minorities. So my father-in-law, who often tells this story about the Gire Khan, who's of course fought on the side of the Nazis and is imprisoned, and then so he's from Crimea, and when he's about to be sent back, right? He's about to be sent back after the agreement at Yalta. He reveals that he has the Order of the Bath from to the British officer who's been ordered to send him back. There are different versions of this story, but in the most kind of the one with the most pathos, the British officer says, "No, we will not send you back. You have the Order of the Bath, the highest order of the British Empire, and the Ghireh Khan says, "No, I will, me and my men," and that's a step too far, and so he's sent back and, of course, executed when he goes back. But all of that is to say, what about people who weren't Orthodox? What about the other groups, the other nationalities who were Muslim or Buddhist? Do you have anything about them?
Okay, thank you for the question. The highest British the highest order of the British Empire did not help Andrei Shkurov, who was handed over to the Soviets. He was one of the commanders of the emigre Cossacks. He also had a very high British order. They still handed him over to the Soviets. So that was not necessarily an argument. Yes, I did look a little bit into the non-Russians, non-Slavic even minorities that resided in, let's say, France or Germany. They also were active. They also had their own system of representation, let's say, in Nazi Europe. So when the Germans would occupy a country, they did the same thing in Germany proper, and then when they would occupy, let's say, Belgium or France, they would establish like a local office. They would establish what was called a Russische Vertrauensstelle, or Russian Trust Office, the Russian Coordination Office. So basically an institution to run the local diaspora. And so every single ethnic group almost had their own Vertrauensstelle. So Russians had the Russian one, it was a big one. Belarusians had their own. Ukrainians had their own. There were non-Russians who participated in the conflict on the side of the Germans. They had their own political organizations, micro-political organizations, and attempts at influencing the Germans. The Germans did play that card. The non-Russian nationalisms were supported as per Rosenberg. You see, it all pertains to where they were and what kind of contacts in the German institutions they had, because the Germans themselves, Nazis themselves, I should say, they did not have a unified policy towards nationalisms per se. So, for example, Hitler policy was nothing but German National Socialism. National Socialism is not to be exported. This is our national product. These people are slaves. We need to use them. Rosenberg, for example, the chief minister of the occupied Eastern Territories, he was all going gangbusters for the non-Russian nationalisms, Ukrainian and Georgian and Azerbaijani and Kalmyk, what have you. So these people also participated in the war on the Nazi side. How successful were they? Well, for example, I really was interested in Georgian diaspora, the very rich diaspora in France specifically. They also participated. They had their own units. Their emigres also went even through this. In August 41, they went through the same camp. Training camp, both all wearing German army uniforms, and here's the group of Russian officers that are going into the Soviet Union, and here's a group of Georgian officers of their own Georgian civil war, also wearing German uniforms and preparing to go against the Soviet Union. And then one of the Russian officers said, "Oh yeah, we saw them, these nationalists, but they did not enjoy as much respect as we did, because we are Russian officers. We enjoy the respect of the proper guys here, of the German majors and Hauptmanns, captains, and a colonel spoke to us and toasted to New Germany and olden Russia, and we were like, yes, we're gonna go. And these people, look at them, they betrayed Russia." So Georgians also tried to scheme and win favors, curry favors with the National Socialist regime. And again, I mean, Rosenberg guaranteed in writing, as far as I remember, that Georgia will be independent and will be an independent state in, drumroll, mid-March 1945. So they finally managed to convince him by that time. But by that time, everything was lost.
Okay, we have another question from one of our Zoom attendees.
So another affiliate of the Melikian Center. I'm curious to know what happened to ROVS after World War II. Do you have any information that you can share about the children and grandchildren? Did they continue fighting? How did they respond to the dissolution of the Soviet Union at the end of the 20th century? Did the whites return home to Russia to live once the Soviet Union collapsed? Have they had any influence on the development of modern Russia? Thank you.
Okay, all great questions, and I like when people have many questions like that, and all of them coming from different angles, and meaning we struck a chord. I'll try to be brief because I do have a tendency to talk too much. Do you have any information about children, grandchildren? Well, I met, thankfully, some of the descendants, the grandchildren. Lovely people. That's the only thing I can say. They just accept history as is. They were like, I would write the letter. I would find an address through the grapevine sometimes, and you know, real ladies and gentlemen, so to speak. Old school, very old school. Speak very interesting Russian. Old Russian. You can compare your own Russian to that my own Russian. I compare it, and I think, well, I don't know my own language. So yes, I did have contact with some of the people. In fact, if you look at the cover of this book, these Germans, the second from the right is Boris Nikolaevich von Kartsov. So that's the von Kartsov family, a very deeply rooted, deeply seated aristocratic family. He emigrated after the Russian Civil War. He was one of the movers and shakers of the Rov's participation in the Civil War. He was one of the German generals, Ninth Army, Adolf Strauss's private interpreter, and he died. The Soviets, he was taken captive, and he died in the Gulag in the late 1940s. Did they continue fighting? Well, there wasn't an opportunity to fight after 1945, right? The German army just collapsed and was taken captive. Some of the children went to Korea, for example, to fight in the American army. Some, very few, went to Vietnam, but that's like the next generation. How did they respond to the dissolution of the Soviet Union? Well, most of them were dead by that stage. However, some of the characters that I wrote about, they did see it. Well, how could they respond? Great. Thank you very much. Great. Finally, we won. Looks like we won. By that stage, they already had some contacts with white army history enthusiasts in the Soviet Union itself. There were some in the late 1980s, and they just started bequeathing their legacy of, at that stage, it was mostly like a veteran societies. We have these banners, we have these books, and we will die because nobody. One of the parts of this tragedy that I spoke about is not only that these people fought on the losing side and there was like a walking contradiction, but also that their children didn't really need it, any of it. The children grew up. I read their letters from the 70s, veterans of those 3 to 5 wars. And they're like, well, we're getting old. Our generation's dying out, because they started rapidly in the 60s, just dying out. That generation started going. And our children, they are not really interested. And they became de-Russianized, many of them. They became Americans and French and Brazilians. And they say, well, yeah, Daddy, you with your great stories about how you're trying to save Russia. Yeah, whatever. I got my own life. So that was one of the great tragedies of their life. Did the whites return home to Russia to live once the Soviet Union collapsed? They visited once the Soviet Union collapsed, the younger ones, but they never really relocated en masse. And there were more or less those of them who saw it, and there were those of them who were still kind of in shape, so to speak. They were enthusiastic but confused, because it was clear as day that after almost 8 decades of Soviet rule, well, will Russia restore itself? Is this the Russia that we want? How much influence do you actually have? Which is like kind of zero. So in terms of what influence they had, they helped write history of White Army and Russian exile to the extent that they could. But Rovs disbanded itself. You see, there was a conflict at the end of its existence. So basically, everybody died out, and the older generation, like those who were still kind of around, they just shut Rovs down. But one component of ROV said, wow, we're going to be still standing strong. We can start making new members in the contemporary Russia. And that's why the true ROVs is defunct as of the year 2000. And then there is the pseudo ROVs that considers itself to still be operating, and apparently its members, I don't know what kind of white army heritage they have. They even fight in Ukraine on the Russian side. So for them, history continues, but it's of course an absurd claim that they have any sort of lineage.
I just want to add to Oleg knows a story that I told him in Boston a few months ago about how I went to a ROVs parade in 1995 in Jackson, New Jersey. It was before the Russian Orthodox wedding of a friend of mine, and I had no idea. We got to the wedding early, and these old men came out and marched around. But that was in 1995. I just want to say that children and grandchildren, people of my generation, I do know of numerous cases where they didn't become Russian citizens, but they moved to Russia with their citizenship in their Western European countries or Australia or America, opened businesses, often married local Russians. And when the churches reunified in 2006, the Emigre Church and the Moscow Patriarchy, that also made that easier. And I think because the number of Russians leaving Russia in the 90s up until now from Russia is so high, those in the diaspora who retained the language, and they tended to retain the religion even more so, have kind of come together, though there's friction. So that has kind of helped. It's like new blood was brought into this diaspora, and a few of these white Russian institutions, particularly the church, still exist. We have another question from Yad.
So with reference to the chapters in the book that discussed the Holocaust and prisoners of war, was there anything that you came across where questions about knowledge of the evolution of the Holocaust on the Eastern Front that you could see was in the minds of these emigres, or did they very quickly realize what was happening? The larger process that was taking place in the occupied territories, or were these one-off incidents that they just made comments about in letters home or in diaries?
Great question. So I would say it's kind of nebulous, but of course there is a periodization with regards to German criminality, or rather I should say Nazi criminality, that we can pinpoint. At first, and I would say that's about maybe first 6 months, like winter 41, 42, the first guys start coming back and they start relaying the stories. So they demobilize, short contract, let's say they signed for 3 months, they come back and they start telling the story that, I actually saw the POW camps. Do you know that they don't feed them? Do you know that it's a deliberate policy? And this was just like, but why? This is terrible. These news definitely seeped into the diaspora, so that kind of crushed the idealism a little bit, but it didn't extinguish it, because idealism was like a self-perpetuating, it was all a self-fulfilling prophecy. Okay, well, then that's just another, from their standpoint, that's just another problem that needs to be dealt with. That's exactly why you should volunteer, because better you be in the POW camp as a commandant than some Bavarian who doesn't care, who loves Hitler. Well, at least you can save your kin. Well, you should volunteer. That was one. With the Jews, just like it was part and parcel of this criminality. So there was knowledge that Jews are being annihilated. I remember one letter from it's like a report from group of returning guys who served in the Italian army, and this is early 43. They come back, and they say, well, there are problems, and there are anti-partisan operations which are terrible. They burn the villages with the people inside the barns, and Jews, that just annihilate them, and the locals help them. And the author of this anonymous report says they feel very bad about the fate of the locals and the POWs, but the fate of the Jews does not command any sympathy. So it was, but by mid-war, it's definitely widespread knowledge that there is bad things happening there. right? And this is not just a separated event. And at the same time, on the other hand, I do remember a few letters where 43, some people volunteered very, very late. 43, a person goes to the East Central Army Group and says, and this is like right after Stalingrad, says, my boys in this unit, meaning Germans, are absolutely fine lads. Stalingrad, temporary problems. Not everything's going to be fine. They're not conducting themselves in a criminal fashion, so that's all Jewish Bolshevik propaganda, blah, blah, blah.
Hey, I have a question for you about the portion of military emigres and of emigres in general who supported the Nazis, right? So even if we talk about Europe, and as I've already told you, in China, which I study, it's a very different situation. They're also in Manchuria, they're under Japanese occupation. They're not, they don't, you know, they're not in contact with the Nazis, but say in Shanghai, 50% are defeatists, 50% are defensists. In Shanghai. In Manchuria, the majority support the Soviets. And even people who were active in rogues, the minute June 22nd happens, they switch. And they also switch at Stalingrad, not just because the Russians were then, the Soviets were winning the war, but also because the Japanese, you know, cracked down so hard on the Russians. They just assumed that anybody who was of Russian heritage was going to support the Soviets. So it's also a reaction to that. But you mentioned this number of 40,000 belonging to rogues. So I'm interested what year that's 40,000. And so in terms of, you know, 40,000 out of 2 million white Russian emigres. So when you say like that the white Russians, that the vast majority of them supported the Nazis, I think maybe you're defining white Russian differently than say I would or some others. So for me, the term white Russians are people who left the Soviet Union during the Civil War, right? They didn't necessarily fight in the White Army, but they left because they were against the Bolshevik regime or they didn't like the circumstances. Whereas it seems like you're defining white Russian by those who were in rows. And as Jan already pointed out, this is a small group within the emigres. And I'm also wondering, you haven't said a word about Yugoslavia, about the Kadetsky Corpus, or about the Balkans. And it has, I know it's much more complicated there, but it has always been my understanding that the majority of white Russian military emigres went to Bulgaria and Serbia. And so I'm assuming that what you found, the majority of those who supported the Nazis were in those areas.
Okay, very correct question, but a very easy answer. We should remember that the absolute majority of the emigration tried to ignore the war. That is, the emigration even before 1941 was split not just into defeatists and defenses. This is pertaining already to the kind of like an active group. First and foremost, the emigration was separated into people who just lived their life and activists who still believed in the war. And in the liberation of Russia via different means. So the activists, among the activists, they were a minority. It's hard to pinpoint a percentage. I would say, I don't know, 10%, 15% at best, maybe. So from this minority now, we'd look at it and we take it as our reference group. If we would try to pinpoint who supported whom and where, that's the case that I'm making, that among the activists, among those who still cared about Russia and wanted to liberate it, the majority were defeatists among the activists. Compare the participation of white Russians in the German army, right? And even in the just at the Eastern Front, you know, for 5,000 to 7,000, maybe 3 to 7. It's very hard to come up with a concrete number. This is a ballpark figure. And then 16 or 15,000 in the Russian in the Shutsko, right, in Yugoslavia, what you spoke about. I deliberately excluded that group, not to muddy the water. So altogether, how many immigrants do we have? Well, around 20, 25, maybe 23. active participants in the Axis armies, and then compare it with the number of Russians in the European resistance. Yes, they played prominent roles, and yes, there were true martyrs around them, among them. But the numbers are just, tenfold, if not 20-fold. So that's my point. And in fact, the defeatists themselves acknowledged that most of the emigration kind of lost its steam. Most of the emigration, they prefer to eat the croissant on Champs-Élysées and, oh yeah, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Very good. Huh? But they didn't. They were useless to Russia, as they said. So they didn't even consider them Russian. With 40,000 Rovs members, I can't remember the particular year. As far as I remember, this is like 35, maybe mid 30s. You see, here's another thing that some of the Rovs members were key members. In fact, were taken captive by the Soviets after they've taken Europe, and I read their interrogation protocols, that is Soviet interrogation protocols, some of them that I was able to locate. And it's like, here's a guy who was instrumental, for example, one of the very high-ranking officers, Russian, who was instrumental in recruiting people into the German army during the war. And so the Chekists, the NKVD members, the Smerch members are interrogating him, and they're saying, "So, what about your organizations?" He's like, "Oh, all the organizations, military organizations, they were all just clubs of cups of tea, so to speak. That we did nothing. We just gathered together." And he's like, "It was all useless by 1941." And I'm like, not very useless. You help recruit people, so they needed to present, of course, a particular case for their non-participation. And in fact, this is another thing, what I called verbal masquerade. I mean, again, I'm not out to bash them. It's just the record is clear on that. Rovs after 45, Rovs members in Europe, they needed to somehow provide their own bona fides, and in the eyes of the Allied occupants, right? In the eyes of the Americans, in the eyes of the Brits, because there was information already floating around that the White Russians, the collaborators, some of them supported the Nazis. They have organizations that are right-wingers. Now, all of a sudden, Rovs members, high chiefs of Rovs, in fact, they needed to present a case that, well, even if we fought on the German side, we didn't fight against you. We fought against our old enemies, and it was all done because we're standing for the freedoms of the peoples of Russia, not because we like Hitler. So all this Hitlerian talk was just swept away. Another example, one of the big examples, von Lampe, right? He was the head of Rov's department in Germany, and once the Germans started occupying the European countries, they were kind of incorporating, the Rovs just decided to incorporate little departments into Lampe's department. So he was like, it was a gigantic department that had multiple countries in it that he was controlling. And of course, he was helping people get into the German army. The record is clear-cut on that. You wouldn't expect anything else from him, really. After the war, this was brought up inside the diaspora as, well, the war was terrible, and you, Mr. Lampe, you were recruiting people to serve with the Germans and fight for the German cause. What do you have to say for yourself? And he tried to, there is a folder in his archive in Colombia, I think, where it says something like, informations against the defamation campaign against me, something like that. So he was trying to get statutory declarations from those Rovs members with whom he had meetings during the war, whom he had agitated to serve in the German army. And the crux of it was that they would need to say that he told them, you need to fight for Russia, but not for German aims. Or better yet, you need to maybe go home and rethink whether you should volunteer. So it was also wishy-washy. So yeah, this was one of the pages of history that perhaps Lampe, in his case, would like to get rid of. However, when they were bringing up the whole question of Did we participate in the war? Yes. On what side? On the German side. They would always say, well, but that was for Russia. That was for Russia. We did not step away. We were with our people. We're our people. As one of them wrote, who was near Moscow, fought for the whole war he fought. He said, we were with our people and we drank for the second time the sour cup of exile with them.
Okay, David, are there any more online questions? Okay, I just want to end right now with, I think the audience will be interested, and we have an online audience, but also this talk is being recorded, and many people have written me that they couldn't attend, but they will be delighted to see the recording. So I just wanted to ask about this topic in contemporary Russia today, right? With the Russian government accusing the Ukrainians of being fascist, and that was one of the reasons they had to go in there and invade them. So what is the state of this topic? I know that there was, for example, an attempt at a Vlasov memorial, but that got torn down. But to my knowledge, the Krasnov, Pyotr Nikolaevich Krasnov, who was an immigrant, not a Soviet citizen, fought in the Civil War and then fought with the Nazis in the Second War. I think that monument is still up. So I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the politics of it today, because as far as I understand it, it can't be studied the way you have studied it in outside of Russia.
Thanks for the question. It's like, let me be brief, and he was brief for the next 40 minutes, right? The thing is, I can read you a whole lecture on what the situation is. If you're referring to Melikhov's memorial and he just shut it down a couple of days ago because they had another raid, and so it's kind of obvious where things are going. Look, I'll tell you this. Is it possible to publish something like that in Russia? Well, hopefully, perhaps. But what the reaction is going to be, nobody knows. Because I did publish my books in Russia and in Russian, and they sold the whole print run. So that kind of history, I mean, I'm trying to make it obvious that it existed. Let's say maybe 15 or 20 years ago, when I started studying this topic, nobody really cared about the whites, and nobody definitely cared about their participation in the Second World War. In general, there still lingers this officially supported narrative, I would say, that everybody took the position of General Anton Denikin, which was against the Germans, with the Russian people, but not with its invaders, and against the Germans and all the rest of it, which of course is a simplification. So some people present the Russian exile as, if previously, let's say 10, 15 years ago, they didn't even acknowledge that there was a split and that there was a sizable portion of people who participated against the Soviet Union, now they kind of tacitly acknowledge that, yes, there was a split and there were some people who believed in the German cause, but that all kind of fizzed out, and that was, few and far between. So already we can see the narrative changed somewhat. Some Russian historians, and well, I wouldn't even call them historians in a sense. They're, government operators in the sphere of history. They do maintain that no, actually, the whole perception and the whole narrative that emigration actively fought against the Soviet Union. There were some, but not as many as in the resistance. So they kind of like tried to just manually reverse the narrative, which is of course a false narrative. I mean, as I said, the absolute majority of emigres did nothing. Zero. They stayed home and tried to survive. You can't blame them. But those who were active, the majority of them fought against the Soviet Union. That is just, I think it all is linked to the fact that the contemporary Russian Federation wants to be kind of proud of its history, let's say. And if they consider all of Russia's history a thing of pride, then they need to consider the emigration a thing of pride as well. And then what do you do with that page, which is the most pivotal war in the fate of the in the fate of the Russian 20th century, in the history of the Russian 20th century? What do you do with that? So it's very hard. It's you can't have this cake and eat it too. but perhaps they at some point they will find some sort of a medium.
And I should, and we'll end on that, and I just want to say that Oleg's book is under contract to be
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
translated by him into Russian with a major trade press.
Yes, yes.
I
So
don't know.
somehow they managed to purchase
What's
copyright.
the print run? What's the print
Oh, I
run?
do not know. I do not know. We did not speak about the finer details because it's impossible to plan, and we have quite a few years to go. Because, I would like to update this book. You see, there were like 40 plus archives from 12 countries. Now I have something like 70 archives from 20 something countries. I was like, it never ends. This is like, this is a great topic to study.
Okay, well, thank you very much to Oleg for a fascinating talk. David.
For our online as well as the people here, we do have a feedback survey we'd like people to
Okay.
complete. So I'm going to share the screen of the QR code.
Okay, there'll be a feedback survey. All right. Well, and
Thank you.
we'll see you soon, Oleg, or at least I will. Okay, and let's thank him again.
Thank you for your attention and for the great questions. Thank you.
Okay, have a
Great.
wonderful weekend.